In Chapter 10, we are going to look at the muscular system, how it is organized, as well as some of the specific muscles within the system. Now, the muscular system consists only of skeletal muscles. How these muscles are organized will affect the power, range, and speed of that muscle's movement. Now, in the last unit, we looked at the inside of a muscle and the muscle cells. Remember that muscle cells or muscle fibers are organized into bundles, and these bundles are called fasciae. Within a muscle, any given muscle, these fasciae could take on one of four different patterns of organization. They could be in a parallel arrangement, convergent, pennate, or circular. We're going to look at each one of these different arrangements, starting with parallel muscles. This type of arrangement is the most common. Here, fasciae are parallel to the long axis of the muscle. An example of a muscle that has this type of an arrangement is the biceps brachii. The force of a parallel muscle will depend on the total number of myofibrils present. This directly relates to the cross-sectional area of a muscle. For every 1 square inch in cross-sectional area, the muscle can develop roughly 50 pounds of isometric tension. This is where the muscle does not change its length. Imagine pushing on a wall. You're not going to move that wall, but you're generating force, and the muscle is not changing any length. So the more myofibrils a parallel muscle has, the more force it will be able to generate. The next arrangement is convergent. Here the fasciae cover a broad area and then converge on the attachment site. An example of this type, a muscle with this type of arrangement, is the pectoralis muscle. These type of muscles generate less force but have more versatility compared to a parallel muscle of the same size. More versatility. It has the ability to pull in many different directions depending on the stimulation. So look at this muscle. If we use only the upper fibers, we're going to have one type of movement and it will pull in one direction. If we use the bottom fibers, we will pull in a different direction. And if we use the whole muscle, we will pull in even a different direction. Now we have a lot of versatility here, and it looks like we have lots of myofibrils, but we lose on force compared to a parallel muscle with the same number of myofibrils. Why? Think about this. If this muscle is pulling in this direction, these fibers here are fighting it. They're trying to pull in this direction. The ones on the bottom are trying to pull in this direction. They cancel each other out. So even though you are using the whole muscle to do this movement, the upper fibers and the lower fibers are not playing a role. They are canceling each other's effect out so that you are only using really the fibers in the center. This is why you are losing force for the number of myofibrils that you have. Next are pennate muscles. In a pennate muscle, the fasciae are organized at an angle to the tendon. An example of this muscle with this arrangement would be the rectus femoris. Because they are at an angle, you can get more myofibrils in a given area, and as a result, generate more force than a parallel muscle of the same size. There are 3 types of pennate arrangements. Unipennate. Here the fibers are on one side of the tendon like a feather. An example would be the extensor digitorum. Bipennate. The fibers run on both sides of the tendon. This would be the rectus femoris. And multipennate. The tendon branches within the muscle. An example here would be your deltoid muscle. The last arrangement is circular. Here the fasciae are arranged in concentric circles. They form sphincters. An example of a muscle with this arrangement is the orbicularis oris, which circles the mouth. Muscles with this type of arrangement can open and close to guard entrances of the body. Now remember, the purpose of our muscles is to produce motion. skeletal muscles attached to our bones. So when the muscles contract, they will move the bones. The type of muscle attachment will affect the power, range, and speed of a muscle movement. So the architecture of a joint can be classified as a lever. We need to understand the different components that make up a lever. Within a joint, each joint has what is called a fulcrum. This is the fixed point. They have muscles to provide an applied force to that joint. And this applied force is required to overcome a resistance. So the function of a lever is to change the direction of the applied force, the distance and speed of the movement that is produced by that applied force, as well as affect the strength of the applied force. Now, there are three different lever systems. Our joints, all the joints in the body, can be classified as one of three different lever systems. The first is a first-class lever. This arrangement functions like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. The fulcrum here is in the center, between the applied force and the resistance. On these diagrams, instead of using an R for resistance, they're using an L for load. Means the same thing. So here's our fulcrum, our fixed point, and the resistance and force are on either side. So the force and resistance are balanced. An example here would be some of the muscles in your neck that allow you to raise your head. So the up and down, yes, motion of your head is an example of a first-class lever. A second-class lever functions like a wheelbarrow. Here, the resistance is in the center with the applied force on one side and the fulcrum on the other. In this type of an arrangement, a small force is able to move a very large weight. When you think about a wheelbarrow, here's your fulcrum, the wheel. You put your load, the resistance, in the wheelbarrow itself, and then you can put, say, 100, 200 pounds in this wheelbarrow, and you are able to move it with very little force. This is true in our body. When you stand on your toes, you are lifting your entire body weight. Okay? So you are lifting a lot of weight without a lot of force. Your third-class lever system is the most common type in the body. This one functions like a broom or a hockey stick. The applied force now will be in the center with the load on one side and the fulcrum on the other. This type of a lever system maximizes the speed and the distance that can be traveled. Now, you need to understand the trade-offs between these three different lever systems. The first-class lever is the most adaptable. It can change direction, force, and speed, just like a teeter-totter. Your second-class lever system gives you a lot more force, but a smaller distance and less speed. Your third-class lever will give you the greatest distance and the speed, but you are not able to move as much weight, so there is a decrease in force. Now, when we look at muscles, we have to understand certain terminology in how we describe our muscles, and this is origin and insertions. Muscles will have one fixed point of attachment. This is known as the origin. And they have one moving point of attachment. This is known as the insertion. Most muscles originate or insert on the skeleton. The actions that we talk about in reference to a muscle are the movements that are created when a muscle contracts, such as flexion, extension, all these different movements we talked about in the joint chapter. When a muscle contracts, the insertion will be pulled toward the origin. Remember, the origin is a fixed point. It is not going to move. So when a muscle contracts, the insertion will be pulled toward the origin. Now, you are going to cover specific examples of all of these in lab, and we will just go over and highlight a few of the muscles and their actions here in this lecture. Now, muscles very rarely work all by themselves. They interact with each other. But in any movement you perform, there will always be an agonist. The agonist is the main muscle that is responsible for the movement. So, for example, if we want to flex our elbow, the agonist would be your biceps brachii. This is the main muscle involved in elbow flexion. There will also be an antagonist. An antagonist opposes the movement of the agonist. So in our example, the antagonist would be the triceps. So when you're looking at muscles and learning your muscles, this is something to keep in mind. What if I give you an agonist and you know it flexes the elbow, and I ask you for an antagonist, you are going to be looking for a muscle that does the opposite action, that extends the elbow. And in this example, that would be the triceps. Muscles always work in pairs. As one contracts, the other stretches. As one flexes, the other is going to extend. Oftentimes, there will also be a synergist. A synergist is a muscle that assists or helps the movement of the agonist. It's usually a smaller muscle that has the same action as the agonist. And finally, there will be a fixator. Fixator helps to stabilize the origin of the agonist. In our example of flexing the elbow, the fixator would be the deltoid. It helps to stabilize the arm so you can flex your elbow. Now we're going to look at the breakdown of the muscular system, the various divisions, and it looks very much like the skeletal divisions. There are axial muscles. These help to position the head and the spinal column and to move the rib cage. They make up roughly 60% of the skeletal muscles. And then there are the appendicular muscles. They support the pectoral and pelvic girdles and help to support the limbs. They make up 40% of the skeletal muscles. So we're going to start with the axial muscles. And the division of the axial muscles are based on location. There are head muscles of the head, anterior neck, anterior thorax, and the abdomen. Looking first at some of the muscles of the head, we have the orbicularis oris right here. Right? This constricts the opening of the mouth. It is nicknamed the kissing muscle. The occipital frontalis, right along here, when this muscle contracts, it raises the eyebrows. The masseter is a large one here in the cheek. This is the strongest of your jaw muscles, and it helps to elevate your mandible. And here in the side of your head, you have the temporalis. This one also helps to elevate the mandible. So the masseter would be the agonist, and the synergist, the one that helps, is the temporalis. Muscles of the neck include the stylohyoid. This is right in here. These muscles are nice because they tell you exactly where they go and how you can find them. Stylohyoid. It runs between the hyoid bone and the styloid process. This one helps to elevate the larynx. Then the mylohyoid. This is found in the floor of the mouth, and it helps to elevate the floor of the mouth and provide a muscular floor to the mouth. A big one in the neck is the sternocleidomastoid. It runs from the clavicle in the sternum up to the mastoid process. We have one on either side of the neck. If these two work together, contract at the same time, this will cause the neck to flex. But if only one side contracts, it will bend the head toward the shoulder. Muscles of the anterior thorax. We have the intercostal muscles here. There are the external and the internal intercostals. These are involved with respiratory movements of the ribs, and we'll come back to these muscles in more detail when we do respiration. Abdominal muscles. The diaphragm. This muscle divides the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. And this is also your main muscle of respiration. 75% of all breathing involves nothing more than the diaphragm. Then there are the oblique muscles. You have the external and the internal obliques. These are laterally positioned, more on the side. And then we have the rectus abdominis, also called nicknamed the washboard muscle, that runs between the sternum and the pubic symphysis. This is divided by the linea alba, which is a line of connective tissue that runs down the middle. This muscle is nicknamed the washboard muscle because of the tendons that run through it. A well-developed rectus abdominis will have this rippled effect, which looks like a washboard. The appendicular musculature. These muscles help to position and stabilize both the pectoral and the pelvic girdles. They will move the upper and lower limbs. The divisions include muscles of the shoulder and upper limbs and muscles of the pelvis and the lower limbs. Starting with the shoulder and upper limbs, the functions of these muscles is to position the pectoral girdle, move the arm, move the forearm and the hand, and move the hand and the fingers. These muscles are found in the anterior thorax, the back and shoulder, and the brachium and the antebrachium. Starting with muscles of the anterior thorax, we have the serratus anterior. We see them over here on the side. These are found on the chest, and they originate along the ribs and insert on the anterior scapular margin. These muscles, this group of muscles, acts to rotate the scapula. And then here is the pectoralis minor. We see this on the other side. This attaches to the scapula and helps to position the shoulder girdle. Pectoralis major, large one on the front of the chest. This runs between the anterior chest and the humerus. It produces flexion at the shoulder joint. Coming to the back, muscles of the back and shoulder. We have this large muscle here is the trapezius. It covers the back and neck up to the base of the skull, and it inserts on the clavicle and the scapular spine. This muscle moves the scapula, it can elevate the clavicle, and it can extend the neck. When you have a stiff neck, when you wake up in the morning, you've slept in a wrong position, you get a stiff neck, it is the trapezius muscles. It's usually these fibers are right through here that have been irritated. Muscles at the back and shoulder. Some other ones here. We have the supraspinatus. Supra means above, spinatus, the spine. So this muscle is found above the spine of the scapula. This one assists the deltoid in shoulder abduction. So this would be a synergist to the deltoid. Infraspinatus, infra means below. So this one is below the spine on the scapula. This produces lateral rotation at the shoulder. Now, muscles of the brachium. The deltoid, this is a large muscle on your shoulder. This is the major abductor of the arm. So this would be the agonist, and the synergist would be the supraspinatus that we just talked about. Then we have flexors of the elbow. These two muscles are synergists of each other. We have the biceps brachii that flexes the elbow, and it also can cause supination, and it helps to stabilize the shoulder joint. This would be the agonist in our motion of flexion of the elbow. And then the brachialis muscle is a little bit smaller. It's just underneath here. This is a synergist to the bicep brachii because it also can flex the elbow. The antagonist to the biceps would be the triceps brachii. This one extends the elbow. Coming down to the lower arm, the antebrachium, we have flexors of the wrist. There are three main flexors. The palmaris longus runs right down the center. And then on one side, you will have the flexor carpi ulnaris, and on the other side, you will have the flexor carpi radialis. All three of these muscles function to flex the wrist. But then the flexor carpi ulnaris, because it is on the medial side here, right on the side, it also can adduct the wrist. The flexor carpi radialis, because of its location on the lateral side, it can also abduct the wrist. Palmaris longus is the only one that just flexes the wrist because it is right down the center. On the back of the arm, we have the extensors. The extensor carpi radialis, and there's two of them, the brevis and the longus, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. Again, both of these act to extend the wrist, but because of their location, the extensor carpi radialis can also abduct the wrist, and the extensor carpi ulnaris can adduct the wrist. Moving down to the pelvis and lower limbs. The pelvic girdle is tightly bound to the axial skeleton. As a result, it permits little movement or less movement compared to the shoulder girdle. It has fewer muscles, and what they do is they help to position the lower limbs. And these muscles are located in the hip and thigh, as well as the lower leg. In the hip and thigh, the largest muscle is the gluteus maximus. This is the largest and most posterior of the gluteal muscles. This muscle produces extension and lateral rotation at the hip. Just in front of it is the gluteus medius. It's anterior to the gluteus maximus, and it has the opposite action. It does medial rotation, so these would be antagonists of each other. Flexors of the knee. Okay, we have what are called the hamstrings, a group of 3 muscles on the back of the thigh. The hamstrings consist of the biceps brachii, the semitendinous is right next to it, and then the last one here, the tendinous kind of goes over the semimembranous. So these 3 muscles make up the hamstrings. The extensors of the knee are on the front or the anterior of the thigh, and these consist of the quadriceps, or also called the quads. They consist of the vastus lateralis coming down the lateral side, the vastus medialis on the medial side, the rectus femoris that is right down the center, and then the vastus intermedius, which is a deeper muscle and is hidden on this picture. Then we have the muscles of the lower leg. They will produce extension, also known as plantar flexion of the ankle. And the 2 muscles, they are synergists of each other, are the gastrocnemius and the soleus. The gastrocnemius would be the agonist, and the soleus would be the synergist because it's smaller, but it has the same action. Also associated with the lower leg is the Achilles tendon, also known as the calcaneal tendon. This is a large, very strong tendon that is shared by both the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So it comes down and attaches here to the calcaneus.